You are listening to the Billy Dees podcast.
We are waiting just a minute for everyone to engage the live stream. Remember, you can find the Billy Dees podcast on your favorite platform.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. As always, I am absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you've never checked us out before, we are primarily an interview and a commentary-based podcast. Today, my name is Billy Dees, by the way, and with me is Chris Weekly. Chris, how are you? So glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me back, Billy.
Absolutely. Chris is obviously we're going to do an interview today, but it's more than just an interview. I'm going to say this is more of a co-hosting thing. We're going to talk about autism, and Chris is an advocate for autism, raising awareness about it. And of course, we're doing this today in the wake of the remarks by RFKjr. that sparked a lot of online commotion and otherwise in the media. So we want to analyze this. We want to break it down a little bit. And let me start with Chris. Chris, what part of the world are you in? You're in the Midwest somewhere, right?
I am. I'm in Wichita, Kansas.
Wichita, Kansas. Like you probably have heard the song, "The Wichita Lineman." You remember that one?
You know, that might be a bit before my time.
It was before my time. It was before my time too. But see,
okay, no, I can't say that I've heard it.
Okay, that's fine. I always chuckle because my usual comeback, my little snarky comeback is, well, Abraham Lincoln was before my time, but I know who he was. That's my little joke. But anyway, you're in that part of the world. That's a great, hardy part of the world. Tell us a little bit about you, your childhood, and of course, you have some version of autism. When did you start to realize that was going to be an issue?
It was an issue early on for me. I was really the odd man out in the family. I didn't do things my other siblings did. I played different. My vocabulary became pretty advanced, and I was a fan of probably talking to my grandparents and aunts and uncles more than my peers, because for me, early on, I was just fascinated with information and any way I could get information I didn't have. Now, I wasn't diagnosed until my early 30s. So,
oh, wow.
From childhood to, 30s was really just crushing tribulation, if I'm honest. Everything from barely graduating high school to struggling with, how to get into a job. I tried college. College was a nightmare. It looked too much like high school, so I dropped out and ended up spending my free time at Barnes & Noble, drinking coffee, reading books, studying exam prep material, and slowly but surely getting into the field of technology. Everything from moving from help desk to acting systems engineer, and then cloud infrastructure for a while. And fast forward to where I am today, getting involved in the bleeding edge of AI, working with a great educational startup, education-wise for both business and scholastically, and then starting my own company, going in based on the topic that we're going to be discussing here.
Sure. This may seem like a very basic question. A lot of people talk about autism, and they throw it out into the verbiage of everyday language when we talk about certain issues. But a lot of people really don't know what it is. In layman's terms, how would you describe what autism is?
My own description of autism, I would placate that onto a science fiction movie way back in the day. I think maybe the late 80s or early 90s, called Alien Nation, where you had aliens who crash landed in LA and were trying their best to fit into a world that they weren't from, that they didn't fully understand in the world, and living in a world that doesn't fully understand them. Traits and behaviors, different movement types, very specific diets that are very stringent and strict. But from the human perspective, it's really our brains develop very differently, and where you catch all of the information around you, sight and sound and touch and all of that, you have a certain amount of receptors in your brain. Just think of them as, just strands of connectivity. Mm-hmm. With many autistic people, we can have from 1/3 to 2/3 more strands, which means more is allowed to come in. And when you have too much coming in, think of it like the old Pentium processor, when you would try to get as much as you could out of your PC, and then it would crash. And those crashes happen to us in a very organic, very uncomfortable, very frightening way for us, but a very unpleasant display sometimes for people around us who don't understand. And many times we just need to reset like you would your old Pentium computer.
Yeah. Now, autism isn't just a flat condition. We hear about it being a spectrum, and that spectrum can range from barely noticeable, like it is with, let's say, Elon Musk. He's probably one of the more famous figures. And here again, there's a big medium in between, and on the other side, you have individuals who are, for all intents and purposes, they're incapacitated. They cannot function in society in a normal way. Is that correct?
That is correct. However, we are finding that thanks to technology, we're actually able to reach. Technology can allow more brilliant minds to be reached. And it couldn't be a better time right now for anyone with not just a neurological disorder or disability, but physical disabilities and other mental handicaps as well. Technology is really allowing us to leverage ourselves more into the world. And in many cases, the world doesn't understand and isn't ready or have the capacity to bring us in further. I'm a firm believer that more autistics like me are out there. Maybe they need a lot more support than I do, but they still have brilliant minds that are capable of innovating, and people, they're just not aware.
I've noticed that there's two talents that seem to come very early in life. Okay, if you're very talented at either one of these things, it's going to come early. And I've also noticed that a lot of neurodivergent individuals have these two talents. And one is math and the other one is music. Is that that's just my observation, but it seems like those two things are kind of special. Is that your finding? And you're good at technology. Math has got to be part of that.
Actually, math and music are not part of that.
Okay.
We're not all math geniuses. I am good with figuring out how to create solutions, which has been a big help. I know back my freshman year of high school, I worked with a fellow student, and the objective in drafting was to create a bridge across two tables, and your grade was based on the amount of weight it could hold between the two tables. And while most students wanted to go with a very creative bridge, I remember an old video of G.I. Joe, an old cartoon of G.I. Joe, and they had this flat bridge. And I said, you know what, the flat bridge will probably hold more weight. So that's what we went with. And it held 176 pounds before it buckled. So figuring out how to move forward is something that I'm really good at. And I don't have some of the emotional pain points about a problem, thinking about the problem, wondering how to make the problem just kind of get boxed away so you don't have to deal with it. When there's an issue, my first thought is, how do I solve this issue? Which, when working around others who have problems and saying, well, how do we solve that, when really they just wanted somebody to listen
Mhm.
is a huge pain point in my life, because that signal never gets to me. It's like, how do we solve it, instead of I'm just supposed to listen to them and care.
Well, interesting. Getting to RFK's comment, talking about the spectrum, he referenced 25% of people diagnosed with autism are, have function difficulties. They need help getting through life. And I don't know how this happened, but this spun out of control online. He was accused of making sweeping statements about autism. And I found some of the reactions we'll talk about in just a moment. Let me go ahead and play RFK's comments, and then we'll come back.
25% of the kids who are diagnosed with autism are nonverbal, non-toilet trained, and have other stereotypical features, head banging, tactile and light sensitivities, stimming, toe walking, etc.
Okay, now here again, I chose that clip because he specifically said 25%. And you and I talked about the spectrum, where you have some people it's barely noticeable, other people it's a chronic condition. Let's just talk about, let's take that one moment. I know you were at the ICANN conference, and I believe that stands for International Conference for Autism Neurodevelopmental Disorders. Did I say that correct? Neurodevelopmental disorders. You were at that conference, and that caused quite a buzz. What was your reaction on the floor?
On the floor, it was, I didn't hear it right away. I was probably still preparing to give my presentation there. But I do remember stopping when I began to hear a lot of the conversation about the 25%, and also the comments on when, autistic kids will never pay taxes or hold a job. And the big disconnect is he's not wrong about many autistics who need constant support, who will struggle with day-to-day things that are relatively easy for the rest of the world. Toilet training, speaking, there are many, many, many nonverbals out there that are finally, through typing, able to be heard, some for the first time in their lives. And so when you look at all of the spectrum of conditions and the severity that can happen, it's all on an individual basis. And I still believe with that 25% that was quoted, many of the things he talked about stimming, I stim a lot. I have to have a swivel chair or a rocking chair. I pick my fingers. I never really grew into, because they really weren't a thing. And when I was growing up, fidget toys, fidget spinners, that stuff just didn't exist. Toe walking, I did my own fair amount of toe walking. I had a lot of additional physical delays. When I graduated high school, I was 5'4", and now I'm 5'10". So, just because the delays are there or something, or they're not progressing, doesn't mean that they never will. And that's the thing that it really bugs me about the clinical side of diagnoses and everything that goes with that. It's always talk about what the child will never do, what not to expect that they'll do, but never to, here's what's possible for them. Here are some ways that they could have a more fulfilling life. Not enough of that is talked about, and that in itself is highly frustrating.
Yeah, that's a fair point. That's a very good point. I kind of feel that nonetheless, he was unfairly criticized, I think, and they twisted his words around to make it seem something really ugly, when in actuality, he was trying to call attention to a problem. Now, my understanding is, if you go back 30 or 40 years, autism in general was a fairly rare diagnosis. I've heard different numbers, but 1 in 1,000, 1 in several thousand, and so forth. A lot of people have pointed out, well, methods of diagnosis has changed, and there might have been a lot of people who should have been diagnosed, or the other way around. But I personally feel that the data is there. Recently, the numbers shifted from 1 in 36 to 1 in 31. And this is just within the last, recent period of time here. When you think about 1 in 31, that to me sounds relatively high, especially when you consider that this isn't the only problem that youth is having. Other things like juvenile diabetes, being overweight, all of these other types of problems are also on the rise. I can remember, here again, just a practical observation, no data, but my practical observation coincides with the data. I went to grade school in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And I went to a grade school that was 1 through 8. So I entered, at first grade, and every year was a big grade school. Every year, an entire class left and another class came in. So for that 8-year period, thousands of kids came through that school. And I can tell you the number of chronic conditions in general, whether it be, something developmentally, whether it be something with chronic allergies, potentially fatal allergies, just chronic diseases in general, juvenile diabetes. I can remember about 3 or 4 kids during that 8-year period that had conditions that required special care from the class. For the most part, chronic conditions in children, by my experience in that particular school, was rare. And in talking to parents today, when I have friends, I have coworkers, it seems like if you have a half a dozen of them in the room, one of them is going to have a child that has some sort of a chronic illness. I don't know if it's from the food that we're eating, certainly processed food like RFK has brought up. Even if you try to eat healthy, we're the products of our environment. So if you're growing food or whatever, it really depends on where you're living. The atmosphere, the water, the ground, all of these things have issues. And I don't know that I have something I can point my finger at to say that something is causing it. But I think what Kennedy tries to do in these situations is to point out that these problems are growing. They're getting worse. And to prevent this, to understand it, is something that we need to be ahead of the curve on. I don't believe he was trying to generalize all autistic people. Do you want to speak to kind of the things I just said? Am I correct in that observation that it seems like autism now is something you hear about very regularly?
Let me premise with my own personal belief and opinion on this, and that is, at the conference, I learned quite a bit about genetics, and it's a genetic. You can call it a mutation, or you can call it, what you will. But, in the reality of things, as rare as autism once was, it's been with us. Autistics have walked with, side by side with our fellow man. And when you look back at everyone who's been celebrated, who's lived many, many, decades or hundreds of years ago, that they say was most likely autistic, that was before, modern medicine or modern agriculture, pulling things out of the ground to create chemicals. A lot of this, hadn't arrived in civilization yet, but autism was there just as just as much as any other genetic disability or disorder that has been down through the ages. Now, the one thing that I really didn't appreciate is that he barely talked about women. And it's my personal belief that women are not diagnosed correctly, and that there are many, 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 many more women out there who are autistic than the science even understands yet. Also, the minority population is probably the least tested. And so you have minorities in a lot of the country who may just appear to be problem children. I mean, I was a problem child. Humor was what I leaned on. And so it got me in all kinds of trouble at school. But in case in point, you have to understand that there are probably brilliant minds in the minority community that are undiagnosed. And if they were diagnosed and were able to be put on a proper path of great life management, there is something untapped there, some innovation that we might never see unless we are more diligent in that community.
Very interesting points. I know that I have heard that for whatever reason in women, autism is not diagnosed as often. Is that correct? Is that what the...
Yeah, they're misdiagnosed with bipolar, multiple personality disorder, all these other diagnoses. And you'll find that when you speak to women who are diagnosed late, that once they receive that diagnosis and a way forward, they begin to really accelerate in how life it works for them. And it answers all the questions that maybe they've spent 60, 70 years alive just hoping to find. Also at the conference, when it comes to the severity, the onset, and the increasing numbers of autism, really they discovered and they brought slides that were very easy to understand from my perspective on how these mutations are further exacerbated based on a lot of the external things from the environment. They have looked at food. They have looked at, of course, vaccines, which has been a controversial thing for many years now, but also water, other parts of our lived environment, especially with technology.
Yes, that's interesting. And without getting into the whole vaccine part, my issue with that is we should be able to examine these issues without it becoming a controversy. There's nothing wrong with just taking a better look at something, and it seems like even that is problematic. And I noticed that in the reactions. I'm going to be kind of critical of some. You have to be very careful choosing your words here. Some of the autistic community that I believe lashed out against RFK. I saw some remarks taking issue with the word epidemic. Saying one of the ones I noticed said, "My son is not an epidemic; he's a human being." I don't know where they're coming from some of these approaches. It would be no different than, okay, we have a flu epidemic or we have something else, and say, well, we got to find out what's causing this because it's an epidemic. And somebody whose child has the flu, you'd say, well, my son's not an epidemic; he's a human being. Okay, it has nothing to do with a slight on that community. It has to do with why are these incidents raising, and like you say, I'm sure a lot of them always existed. I don't question that at all, but it does seem like they're more prevalent. Is there something in our society that is exacerbating this? And this goes on with a lot of other things. With the severe allergic reactions, let's say to peanuts, which I do not recall during my childhood. I never remember school having to be evacuated because somebody brought peanuts into school. Now, I'm being facetious, but you get my point. These are all relatively new occurrences, so something is happening. And the thing with when I say political correctness, I'm referring not politically, but the terminology. It seems now that the way we handle things is we just call it something else. You're beautiful on the inside, you're not fat. People don't die anymore. They pass away. And as a matter of fact, when my mother died, I did a little experiment by accident. I just happened to notice in conversation when people asked me how my mom was doing, sometimes I would say, well, she passed away. And then I said, oh, that's too bad. So how's work going? It'd be almost nothing. But if someone would ask me how my mom's doing, and I said, well, mom died, there was that moment that there was a different reaction. And I've often said that I don't know that these softer terms, whether it be with the term, I understand why, the R word is something we don't want to say. I get it. But even disabled now is problematic in some circles. You can't call something what it is. And I think, me personally, I'll ask your opinion about this. I think when you soften the terminology, you soften the message about how serious the problem is. That's and I'm not saying that in all cases, but in a lot of cases. And I really feel that we got into a little battle about how these people should be referred to rather than their condition. Do you want to comment on that?
I do. I can understand where someone would be upset, at the terminology, being, autism is an epidemic. Well, if you said autism is an epidemic, autism is, again, a neurological disability, and that's the diagnosis name. Now, if you say autistics are an epidemic, then I have severe issue with that, because autistics are human beings. I'd like to say just simply our wiring is different, mm-hmm. which makes communication somewhat more of a challenge. Unfortunately, the challenge seems to be too one way, and we can save all that for another conversation. But autism is, to me, more of a health crisis. I would have called it a health crisis, honestly, rather than epidemic, because when you look at an epidemic like the flu or measles or something like that, that is something that absolutely everyone has the capability of catching.
True.
Some people are just built a little different, so it's more mild on them. It's not as severe, which again is the importance of the individual. We're all absolutely different, and that really gets lost. So when it comes to autism, it's not 100%. It's not 100%. Everyone has the chance. It's 1 in 31 according to the studies. But again, I think the studies are suspect, and sometimes they're given too much credence. Mm-hmm. The problem is also we're talking about America. At the conference, I met great people from all over the world. And really, if the media did its due diligence and actually decided to search out for conferences around autism, this month would have been a great time to do it, mm-hmm. and actually get an education about autism and other neurological disorders like severe OCD, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and the like. Mm-hmm. Where were they? They weren't there.
Right. And I'll tell you, in full disclosure, I've had OCD, and I still have it. It's not. I didn't have it particularly bad like some people do. I still have a tendency to check doors, but I've got it to the point in my life where it's still there, but I control it. It doesn't control me. And I can tell you, I struggled with it when I was in my 20s. I really had a hard time with it. And these things are real. And people often will say, well, why can't you reason your way out of it? You don't need to wash your hands 2 or 3 times. Once is enough. And your mind knows that. I know when I was going through that, I understood that. But you still feel compelled. And these things are real. I get into discussions, too. I'm very much a part of the community that serves people in recovery. And this includes mental disorders, and it also includes addiction. And I will often, people take me to task for calling addiction a disease. And I think this kind of folds into autism. People think, well, it's a germ, okay? And it's not a germ, and it doesn't fly from one person to another, and it gets caught, so therefore it's not a disease. But what happens is you don't necessarily make a choice. Like, I often fight that stigma. It usually comes upon you slowly. It starts with one bad day at work, and you come home and say, man, I need a beer. Or, man, I could sure use a glass of wine. And a lot of times it passes and it's of no consequence. And other times later in the week, it becomes more of an option. And it happens over months and years, just like getting overweight does. It doesn't just happen in one day. And all of a sudden you realize that you're locked into a pattern and you're dependent on something that alters your mind. And by that time, physical changes have happened in your brain. So it's not something you can just will away or say, well, gee, I guess I made a mistake. I should stop taking it. And by that time, you're wired. It's your body says, I need this to feel good. I need this to survive. And from that aspect, I understand the confusion, because people will say it's a process, just like in the case of autism, it's something in your wiring. People have a tendency to associate diseases with germs, with viruses, with bacteria, and it isn't always that type of a thing. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a fair assessment. When it comes to lived experience, the less visible that a disorder or a syndrome or disability is, it's much more difficult to get support from the world, because it's a human thing when people hear the word syndrome or disorder or disability, to see if they can see it. And if they can't see it, they end up putting up a barrier of disbelief that they, one, really shouldn't, and two, it's a barrier that we didn't request, and it's a much tougher barrier to get over in order to get some semblance of support or assistance.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. One of the, in my advocacy for the recovery community is, I think there's I'm going to use a term we don't use. A drug addict is an ugly word. We don't use that term in the business. But there's a stereotypical vision that a lot of people have of a quote unquote drug addict, that somebody's wearing tattered clothes, they got long hair, they're driving their car 100 miles an hour down the road, and they're shooting at the police. Okay, that isn't what quote unquote drug addicts look like. Somebody who's suffering from addiction is in your neighborhood mowing the lawn. They're going to work. They're doing a lot of other things, and they look perfectly normal. And it's always such a shock when this person gets in trouble with the law or flunks a drug test at work. It's always such a shock, because their response is, well, they always acted so normal. But they did. It doesn't fit what most people consider those conditions to be. And therefore, they have trouble associating it with a condition that sometimes can spin out of control from no decision on the part of the person involved. So I think that's all a good point. In closing here, we covered some great things. Obviously, the autistic community is, at the very least, I will say this, at the very least, regardless of how you feel, RFK said or didn't say anything correctly or incorrectly. At the very least, the autistic community is getting some attention now. You heard about it, once in a while, somebody would make a connection between that and vaccines, and it would always, turn into a discussion, then it would disappear. Now it's starting to be recognized as something that is prevalent, a lot more prevalent than what people thought it was. And it is something that needs attention in terms of treatment. And I don't know if there's, anything directly, you would probably know better than I, that could possibly affect worsen it in our society, but it's being studied now. So I would think that is a point of hope. What would be, if I'm right or am I wrong, let me know, what would be your point of hope for people in the autistic community?
One, there are a couple of things. People for autistic people like myself, everything comes in literal. And so when you hear and you see these reports and you see it cut into particular pieces, I've talked to a lot of people in the last couple of days in the community, and they're terrified. They're terrified to go back to their doctor. They want to throw away their Fitbit. They want to get rid of their cell phone because of terms like registry and and collecting very specific health records and things like that. So that's a point that I definitely wanted to make sure that I addressed. People are very scared. The language could have been better, but on top of that, while this whole narrative that can be misinterpreted around what was said about fixing it and curing it and solving it and preventing it. If you want to lessen the chances, figure out how to lessen the chances that a child is going to be diagnosed with autism, I mean, that's fine, but I would like to see a lot more time and energy and money, if needed, go into actually educating the public properly and utilizing us with lived experience to help teach the message that we're already here and we're already struggling in this world. And we have shorter lifespans, and we can talk about that another time. And we have parents of autistic kids who go to bed every night going, have I prepared enough for my child? And I would really like to see a day where employers are educated enough to where some of these parents can go to bed at night and say, I think my child's going to be fine.
Those are all fantastic points. And I really feel that empathy is something that we are lacking. I've talked about this before. Unfortunately, here in Ohio, the empathy, the sympathy for things like addiction is actually pretty good, because it has been such a chronic problem here in Ohio that just about everybody has been touched by it. It's real easy to say the kid across the street's always been a problem. When they get into trouble with alcohol or drugs or something else, it's all of a sudden different when it's your kid or your father or whoever. And because it strikes all ages. And I would extend that to the autism community and so many other communities. This idea that it's something that's foreign, that is maybe a little bit scary, is usually lessened when you take the time to understand it. And I just wish we had people that would take the time to understand things in general a little bit more, whether it's autism, addiction, mental wellness, or any of those kind of things. Is that would you agree with that? Maybe we just need to be better people as a society.
I agree with that. We're at a stage now with technology where we think that our lives can just move at the speed of technology, and we move at the speed of people. That's the best natural speed we have, and it's way past time for people to put the technology down for a while, take a breath, and have a little bit of common sense and critical thinking before responding to things. But also, I would honestly like to see us in a day where every approach to every encounter first starts with, that is a fellow human being.
That's the crux of the interview right there. I mean, so many people, as we always say, you never know what someone is going through. They could have a serious illness in the family. They could have financial problems. They could have, the possibilities are endless. And when we see somebody in distress, rather than point our finger at them and say, what the F is wrong with you? Sometimes maybe you should ask that question in a much more gentle way. And say, is there something you need? Is there something, we can help you with? It would be a much better world if more of us did that. But unfortunately, that isn't happening. So I do think that there's a lot of hope for the community, and I wish you continued success. One of the things I want to ask you here, again, this is a hot topic. You are obviously, much more about the topic than I do. You've lived it. You're very much involved in, in strengthening awareness about it. Where can people find you and find out more about what you're doing? I know do you still do the YouTube channel and all that?
I'm deficient. I'm getting ready to ramp back up some new content, but I can be found on YouTube at Logical A Meets World. I can also be found at Cryptoglyphics in X. And then you can also find me by my name, Chris Weekly, on Facebook. I'm getting some help with some marketing for my own startup called Logical A, where I go in and I teach companies how to attract, how to hire and retain autistic talent by using a guide that lets me expound on my own lived experience to make it more understandable and really start to begin to bridge comprehension where communication is different between us and the business world.
Okay, that is fantastic, Chris. You're doing a lot, and you're on top of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're making the world a better place, which is more than I can say about myself a lot of times. But you are definitely doing that.
Billy, don't shortchange yourself. You had me on. We had this wonderful discussion. You're a big help. You really are, and I deeply appreciate the time that we've been able to spend together.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And boy, I'll tell you, I really appreciate you coming on. A nice, sane conversation that covered both sides of, if there are such thing as sides in this case, I think was really warranted. So thank you very much. I'll let our audience know that you can find me on X, which is the former Twitter. It is now X, and I'm at Billy Dees on X. That's kind of like my social media home. I have been talked into a Facebook page. So Billy Dees Podcast, we have a small but very active community on Facebook there. And I try to make the Facebook page something like, listen to this latest episode. We try to do more than that. Right? We talk about audio products on there, microphones, things like Chris is doing. And we have a lot of really engaged associates, people like Christy Mickelson, who is very much an advocate for autism as well. So do check us out, and don't forget you can find the Billy Dees podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts are found. We're going on a 10-year history now, and we are on all the major platforms.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you for listening, and Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And we will talk to you again very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Billy Dees podcast. Follow Billy Dees on X at Billy Dees for updates about the program.
Do you listen to music or audiobooks on streaming devices such as Sonos or Amazon speakers? How about on your car sound system? If you use Spotify, Audible, or Amazon Music on any of these systems, you can also listen to the Billy Dees podcast the same way. Billy and his team go the extra mile to make sure our podcasts sound as good or better than anything on the radio. Listening to the Billy Dees podcast has never been easier. You literally just have to ask.